Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, July 27th, 2024. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka bringing us the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. Then, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Crystal R. Sanders, associate professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She's also the author of the book, A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs. Finally, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Paulina Alberto, professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She's the author of the book, Black Legend, The Many Lives of Raúl Grigera and the Power of Racial Storytelling in Argentina. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Erykah Badu, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane. Now, people, get ready for this train to come in, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Crystal R. Sanders.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with this weekly African drumbeat historical calendar of events and freedom fighters whom we refuse to ignore. So here at Freedom Now, we give these events and role models life by acknowledging their deeds. July 25th, 1973. Amy Jacques Garvey crosses over. She helped build the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League, and when her husband was in prison, she took over its leadership. July 25th, 1972. The U.S. health officials admitted using Africans as guinea pigs in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments for over 40 years, providing them with aspirins under the guise of treatment. July 26, 1927, Heidi Santa Maria was born. She was one of the 6 Cuban women in Castro's July 26, 1953 movement that launched the Cuban Revolution. While imprisoned, she witnessed her brother and fiancé tortured to death by the Batista regime. Their eyes and testicles were brought to her in an effort to break her. Upon her release, she joined the guerrillas in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. After the revolution, she held major positions in the New Cuba. July 26, 1969. The first Pan-African Cultural Festival was held in Algeria, bringing together the varied aspects of the African world. July 26, 1956. President Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal to break the neo-colonial control of African national resources. July 27, 1915. The United States invades and colonizes Haiti, setting in motion a long anti-colonial and neo-colonial struggle that continues to this day. July 27, 1937. Open revolt by African workers in Barbados against British colonial rule, one of the hundreds throughout the Caribbean. July 27, 1974, the General Union of Eritrea Women was founded at the Vanguard Association in the Eritrean War of Independence. July 28, 1917, over 10,000 Africans born in the United States marched down New York City's Fifth Avenue in silent protest of the lynching and racial inequalities. July 29, 1824, Alexandre Dumas, the African author of the classic book The Three Musketeers, is born. July 29, 2001, Fulon Devi, the legendary bandit queen who rose from the lower caste child bride to become the leader of a band of outlawed lower caste rebels who were in opposition of the Indian parliament. She was a champion of the rights of lower caste. Devi was married at the age of 11 to an abusive older man. She ran away, but was abducted and gang raped by upper caste men. She joined the band of lower caste outlaws and returned to murder 22 of her attackers, creating a sensation across India. She eluded capture for a period, but surrendered and was imprisoned for 11 years. In 1996, Devi was elected to parliament as part of the Socialist Party. She was gunned down at the age of 37 on her own doorstep. July 29, 1970, Delano, California grape strike ends with a major victory for the Huelga forces of United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. So-called immigrant farm workers went on strike from 1966, fighting not only the major wine manufacturers, but their mafia henchmen. July 30th, 1945. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the most militant African congressman, was born. Adam Clayton Powell embraced Malcolm X and scores of revolutionaries in a broad alliance to bring about social change in the United States in the 60s. July 30th. Hica da Silva, the Joan of Arc of Brazil, a legendary African slave who rose to immense heights of power as an organizer and leader of slave rebellions to become the unofficial empress of Brazil. July 1st, 1969, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi led the overthrow of the puppet regime of King Idris, establishing the Libyan Revolutionary Jamahiriya and providing political, military, and economic support for revolutionary movements worldwide, including the United States. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka with our Revolutionary Events calendar here at Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Central California, and streaming live on the web at www.kpfk.org. We would like to close this session of the program with a collective chant, so please join us wherever you are. In the words of those freedom fighters on the motherland and in the diaspora, Amandla, which means power, and the response Awetu, which means is ours. Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Crystal R. Sanders, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and author of the book, A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs. Thank you for joining us on KPFK's Freedom Now, Professor Sanders.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book on a forgotten migration?
Sure. I grew up in a rural town right outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I was always amazed that many of the Black women who were retired public school teachers who attended my church had masters and PhDs from NYU and Columbia. And I remember one day asking my father, so what made them decide in the 40s and the 50s to travel all the way to New York for graduate study just to come back to our really small rural county and continue to teach? And my father essentially looked at me and said, you really think they had a choice? They really had nowhere else to go. And that stayed with me. And I am a scholar of Black education. And I went in a completely different direction for my first book, but I came back to this topic of they had no other place to go. And so I began digging into, this pattern or trend of Black Southerners going to the North, Midwest, and the West for graduate study. And the more I dug, the more I learned that Southern states, number one, often did not have post-baccalaureate programs for African Americans at public Black colleges, even though there were post-baccalaureate programs at Southern flagship institutions. And number two, that many of these Southern states, as a way to feign compliance with Plessy or the separate but equal decision, decided to subsidize the education of African Americans as they traveled out of state for the same opportunities that white citizens were able to receive in state.
So in some ways, was this an executed Black brain drain from Dixie to the United States Midwest, the North, and the West? And are there examples of same?
Okay, well, first let me say that this arrangement of Black Southerners going north for graduate study was really the brainchild of a Black man. It was the brainchild of Walthall Moore, who was the first Black state legislator in Missouri. And he saw it as a temporary arrangement until Missouri invested more funds in Lincoln University, until Missouri invested enough funds to make Lincoln the Black equivalent of the University of Missouri. So in 1921, he introduced legislation in the Missouri General Assembly to pay for Black students, for Black residents of the state of Missouri to be able to go out of state for the same opportunities that white students could receive in state. So I mention this because he did not envision this as a brain drain. He envisioned this as an opportunity for African Americans to reach their highest potential, while Missouri began to put more resources into the development of Lincoln University. And so this was never to be a permanent arrangement. There was nothing that he envisioned taking more than a few years. But unfortunately, that's not how it worked out in Missouri and across the South. So Black students ended up having to go out of state for the same educational opportunities for decades. But the overwhelming majority of these students returned back to the South. So this is not a brain drain narrative. Only a very small percentage stayed in the North or Midwest or West and never returned to the South after leaving for graduate study. But the overwhelming majority come back home. They come back home ready to use the skills and their training to improve life for African Americans all across the South.
So, does California play a role in your study?
It does. I mean, I found segregation scholarship recipients, and I use the term segregation scholarship recipients because this funding that Southern states provided to African Americans for graduate study was a way of maintaining segregation. So I found that segregation scholarship recipients traveled to almost every single state in the union that admitted Black students to their public and private institutions. And so one of the California stories that sticks out in my mind is the story of a Black man named Charles Ray. And Charles Ray was a native of Raleigh, North Carolina. He was an instructor at North Carolina College, which is today North Carolina Central University. And he decided that he wanted to get a PhD in English. North Carolina subsidized his graduate study, and he matriculates at the University of Southern California. When he graduates from USC in the early 1950s, he is the first African American to earn the PhD in English at that institution. But there are numerous examples of Black Southerners traveling to California, to Washington, to Missouri, to New York, not to Missouri, to Ohio, to Kansas, all of the states in the union that did admit African Americans to their public institutions and their private institutions. We see Black students enrolling in those institutions.
So who was Lloyd Gaines and what role does he play in your study?
So Lloyd Gaines was a native of Missouri. Lloyd Gaines had graduated at the top of his class from Lincoln University of Missouri, and he desired to become an attorney. He knew that he wanted to practice law in the state of Missouri. He also knew that his mom, as a widow with several children at home, really it would not be beneficial for her or for his siblings for him to go out of state for law school. So he decides that he is going to apply to the University of Missouri Law School, which was the only public law school in the state of Missouri in the 1930s, mid-1930s when he applies. Of course, the University of Missouri does not admit him because he's African American. And I should say that the University of Missouri was not an all-white institution. They admitted students from countries throughout the world, just as long as they were not of African descent. And so Lloyd Gaines was offered a segregation scholarship. Missouri said, we will help you to go to law school elsewhere. But Lloyd Gaines, for personal and professional reasons, did not want to study law elsewhere. And he decides that he is willing to litigate this issue. And so he joins forces with the NAACP, with Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall serving as his attorneys. He sues for admission to the University of Missouri based on violation of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, because Missouri had a law school for white residents. According to the Constitution, they should have had a law school for Black residents within the state's borders. And indeed, in 1938, the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with Lloyd Gaines and the NAACP, but they do not compel the University of Missouri Law School to admit him. They essentially say to the University of Missouri, you must create a law school within Missouri's borders for African Americans, or else you must admit Lloyd Gaines to the University of Missouri Law School. So literally, in a race against the clock, the University of Missouri, the state of Missouri creates a sham of a law school at Lincoln University in an effort to keep Lloyd Gaines out of Mizzou's law school. Essentially after this law school is opened, and I should say this law school doesn't open in Jefferson City where Lincoln University was located, but it opened in St. Louis because that was the cheapest. St. Louis was the city where the state could find the cheapest building that they could use for a law school for African Americans. And immediately after the Lincoln School of Law opened, Charles Hamilton Houston announces that they're going to go right back into court and to prove that Lincoln University's law school was not the equivalent of the University of Missouri's law school. Before the NAACP could go into court and prove this, Lloyd Gaines goes missing. I'm of the position that he probably met a violent end for his role in challenging segregation. But he stands as really, one of many pioneers that I write about in the book who seek equal educational opportunities for African Americans. And so we think about this long road to the Brown decision. It is individuals like Lloyd Gaines who paved the way for the culminating decision that is held up as a landmark court case in 1954.
So you suggest that Lloyd Gaines was murdered, I take it. Was there any investigation that turned up any evidence of same?
There have been a few investigations, but it literally the trail goes cold. He was living in Chicago at the time, living at an A Phi A, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity house. He was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and he told his roommates that he was going out to buy postage stamps, and he's never heard from again. There were many rumors about what had happened to him, with some people believing that he just skipped town, that he was just tired of the publicity, tired of the court cases, and he decided to just leave town and perhaps move to Mexico or something. And that was really an idea that was floated by many white people who did not believe that he had met a violent end. But until her death, Lloyd Gaines' mother maintained that even if he had decided to leave the country and start a life elsewhere, he would have found a way to contact her, given the relationship they had. So his family believed that he had indeed been killed, since there was no other contact from him after 1939.
Now, we recall that during the days of slavery, for example, you had a case of Martin Delany, in many ways a forefather of Black nationalism. He seeks to matriculate at Harvard University Medical School, but for racist reasons is ousted. And you had a number of Black students who got their medical degrees in Scotland, for example. And I'm wondering that if during the era of Jim Crow, were there examples of Black students who sought to matriculate overseas?
Yes. I mean, there's always been a history of African Americans going overseas to get their degrees. I think of someone like Anna Julia Cooper, who gets her PhD from the Sorbonne or the University of Paris. However, most of the southern states had rules that they would only subsidize the educations that African Americans secured within the United States. So one of the letters that I came across was a letter from a teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, who was trying to pursue a PhD in Spanish. She was a high school Spanish teacher, and she had gained admittance to the University of Havana in Cuba. And she was quite upset that North Carolina refused her application or rejected her application for financial support since she was not studying within the United States. And despite her numerous appeals, North Carolina's officials maintained that she should seek that degree at an institution within the United States. So I've not found evidence of a segregation scholarship recipient using those funds to study outside of the United States.
Now, you've mentioned a number of women thus far, and I'm wondering if this program of segregation scholarships, did they disproportionately impact Black women, or is that a misperception?
Well, I'll say this. One of the things we must remember is that, I think about it in relation to going back to slavery, looking at the fact that it was harder for enslaved women to run away because of familial obligations and a lack of real knowledge of the terrain. With respect to these segregation scholarships that I talk about, once again, there are familial obligations that make Black women less likely, especially in the 20s and 30s, to go away from home for school. But another issue was where they had received their undergraduate degrees. So many Black women had gone to teacher colleges. And so their teacher colleges, the training they received had not prepared them to enter into graduate programs at most universities across the United States. So especially in the 1920s, 1930s, we see that men were overwhelmingly recipients of segregation scholarships. They typically outnumbered women 3-1. However, by the time we get to the mid-1940s and beyond, we began to see greater parity between Black men and women in terms of being segregation scholarship recipients. Another issue that they had to consider was, if their undergraduate institution was accredited, if they had taken the types of courses that would allow for graduate study. And so we began to see a lot more Black women being able to utilize segregation scholarships in the 40s and 50s. I can tell you a lot of recipients coming from schools like present-day Tennessee State, Spelman College, Talladega College. I'm trying to think of some other schools that had a significant population. Even North Carolina College, by this point, by the 40s and 50s, has large numbers of Black students, including Black women, being able to utilize segregation scholarships. So perhaps one of the most, several well-known Black women who were segregation scholarship recipients, but I'll mention two, being the fact that you and I are both historians. Helen G. Edmonds, who's a native of Virginia, uses a segregation scholarship to attend Ohio State University, where she gets her PhD. Her dissertation was one of the first accurate accounts of the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, and her dissertation became her first book. After she graduates from Ohio State, she joins the faculty at North Carolina College in Durham, present-day North Carolina Central, where she would remain on faculty for nearly 40 years. And she would be instrumental in starting the graduate program in history at that institution, a graduate program that today, we know that there are tons and tons of historians, African-American historians in particular, who have received either their undergraduate or their master's level training in the history department at North Carolina Central. But another example that I would be remiss if I didn't mention would be Christine King Ferris, the older sister of Martin Luther King Jr. She receives a segregation scholarship from the state of Georgia to enter Columbia University after graduating with her undergraduate degree from Spelman College. And she goes to Columbia as an econ major, but after all of the racism that she experiences at Columbia in the econ department, she changes her major and begins doing graduate work in education.
So finally, Professor Sanders, I'm assuming that this program of segregation scholarships terminates during the uprising against Jim Crow apartheid in the 1950s. Having said that, what's next on your research agenda?
Okay, well, first I'll say that the year that segregation scholarships ended varies by state. And so we see as early as 1955 in Missouri, but as late as the mid-60s in the deep South states like Alabama and Mississippi. So there are still segregation scholarship recipients who are matriculating in the early and mid-1960s. But I continue to look at topics related to Black education. And so my next work will consider or examine kind of these early efforts of Black colleges to recruit students from East and West Africa. So I'm going to be looking at, African students that matriculate at Black colleges in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Oh, very good. We look forward to that work. And I would like to thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. We're going to keep this train moving and send you back over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined by Professor Paulina Alberto. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Paulina Alberto, Professor of African and African American Studies and History at Harvard University in Massachusetts, and author of the book Black Legend, The Many Lives of Raúl Grigera and the Power of Racial Storytelling in Argentina. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Alberto.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And thank you for joining us. So who was Raúl Grigera, and why did you decide to write a book about it?
Well, Raúl Grigera, it turns out, was a celebrity of the nightlife in early 20th century Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires was a city with a booming nightlife. This was the period of the 1910s of enormous immigration, European immigration to Buenos Aires. It was a city that had gone from being a little bit of a sleepy village to being an enormous cosmopolitan metropolis over the course of just a few decades. And it was a city with a booming nightlife and sort of a bohemian scene. And Raúl Grigera was a celebrity of that scene around 1910, 1920. He was an Afro-Argentine man. He was a young man in his 20s around 1910. He was a very well-dressed man, a man who cared about his appearance, a dandy, if you will. And it turns out that he was a figure who was legendary, especially in the world of the emerging tango, what would become Argentina's national music. But I didn't figure this out right away. It actually took me a little while to understand why he was famous. And that is because the first set of stories that I encountered about him were, in fact, quite different. They told the story of a man who was, it was unclear where he came from. It was inexplicable how he rose to fame. And the only thing that made sense to these storytellers is that he had a very hard fall from celebrity into infamy. And they figured he had it coming as a Black man who was considered to be out of place in a society that was purportedly white. And that kind of explains, perhaps I can back up a little bit and tell you a bit more about how I encountered him. I first met Raúl Grigera in the National Archive in Argentina in the photography section, because I was looking for stories to tell or ways to do research about the history of Afro-Argentines in the 20th century in Argentina. I don't know if your listeners know this, but Argentina is a country that has kind of presented itself to the world and is known in the world as a country of largely European immigration. And Argentines have, for at least 100 years or more, embraced the idea that they are citizens of a country that has little to no Black or Afro-descendant presence, little to no indigenous presence, and is largely populated by the descendants of European immigrants. And this is the case still today, even though that is slowly changing. But it's the case even though in the early 19th century, on the eve of independence, the city of Buenos Aires, which is the city of my birth, had about 30% of the population that was Afro-descendant. And the numbers were even higher, up to 50% or above, in some areas, some provinces to the northwest of Buenos Aires. So some people acknowledge that there was an important African presence in the colonial period when, especially in the 18th century, when Buenos Aires became a major center of the trade in African captives. But they tend to, even if they acknowledge that presence, they tend to believe that Afro-Argentines, their presence dwindled, and as a population, they, quote, disappeared over the course of the 19th century. So on the one hand, we have that still very powerful and very widespread story of Black disappearance, which supposedly takes place sometime between the late 19th and the early 20th century. And on the other hand, today we have a resurgent Afro-Argentine movement made up of people who descend from enslaved people, but also from migrants who are Afro-descendants from other parts of Latin America. So they're very visible in the present, and they were quite visible in the colonial period and the late 19th century, Afro-descendants were. And yet in the 20th century, it's very difficult to kind of narrate their continuous presence. In part because it was in that century that Argentina stopped using any kind of official racial classification, and there were complex processes of racial reclassification that even people of African descent underwent that led them to stop using racial markers to identify themselves. So what scholars have shown, in the last 40 years, especially my colleague George Reed Andrews, who wrote a fantastic book called The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, he showed that Afro-Argentines did not so much disappear as become officially invisible in all kinds of statistics and censuses and national documentation. So it's quite difficult to find people of African descent marked as such in the National Archives. And this is why I went to the photography section for the 20th century. And as I was looking up people of African descent, I encountered a note card that sent me to look at a sort of an envelope of photographs of a man named Raúl Grigera. And I received this envelope, and it was clearly a man of African descent. He had clearly lived in the 20th century. He had clearly been famous enough that people wanted to photograph him at different stages of his long life. So there was one early photo of him wearing a tuxedo, standing in a photography studio, looking extremely dapper. And then later photos of him looking a little bit more elderly, more time-worn, possibly in a situation of homelessness, being followed by a policeman in the streets. And then a even later set of photos of him in some kind of institution surrounded by men in white coats. And so I thought, who is this man? He was clearly famous, but it wasn't clear what made him famous. And that's what set me on a research project that took over 10 years to complete.
So he lived many lives, and you indicated previously that he was subjected to infamy. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the notion of his many lives is that I realized that, I was finding information about him in the early stages of my research. I was finding information about not so much a man known as Raúl Grigera, but a character known as El Negro Raúl, or Black Raúl, as he was commonly known. There was so much information about this man, El Negro Raúl, from newspaper and magazine articles, to short stories, to histories of the city, to early films, plays, tangos, and there was even what turns out to now be acknowledged as Argentina's first syndicated comic strip from 1916 was called The Adventures of El Negro Raúl. So it turned out it didn't take me that long to amass, hundreds of what I started to realize were stories about this character, El Negro Raúl, and they were all quite similar in their broad outlines. And they followed this kind of arc that I mentioned before, that it was impossible to know where he came from, that he rose to fame, but the fame was a kind of spurious fame. It wasn't really through his own doing. It wasn't because of any merit of his own or any talent. At best, it was because he was kind of a bit of a parasite who attached himself to the wealthy young playboys of the city's elite, and who sort of stuck around with them in order to get their hand-me-down clothing and a meal here and there. At worst, he was their sort of personal clown and buffoon, a person who allowed himself to be abused quite cruelly. In fact, there's a whole litany of stories about the kinds of indignities that he would put up with, including nudity and sexual abuse and physical abuse, supposedly in exchange for these kinds of access to meals and the high life in a way. And then there were these stories that kind of gleefully told the story of his decline, of the way that his life sort of fell apart once these aristocratic young men stopped showering him with their wealth and their attention. And the stories kind of gleefully predict, and in some ways sort of get out ahead of his decline and his death. And so one of the tropes in this story, one of the ways the story is told and retold, is that these storytellers of his life are constantly declaring him dead before his time. Now, what I realized about these stories, which are quite pat and pretty repetitive, is that the minute I started using my skills as a historian and not taking the stories for granted, but going into the archive and beginning to do some research on the man himself, on his family, on the people around him in the Afro-Argentine community, I realized that these stories were patently false. They were not 100% false. There were some points of coincidence between these stories and the biography or the more historical life of the man Raúl Grigera, but there was a huge gap between the two. There was really a deformation of his public character. And so I started realizing, on the one hand, that I had to do the research to reconstruct the life of Raúl Grigera, the man, the historical man situated in a community and a family and a broader society. And on the other hand, I had to understand why these stories followed the pattern that they did. And what I quickly figured out is that the stories about his life, this kind of arc of a rise from obscurity and then a precipitous fall into a kind of obliteration, actually traced, followed almost to perfection the arc of the broader story of Black disappearance in Argentina, right? That Afro-Argentines had very tenuous origins in the nation, that it's not really clear that they ever were present or in what numbers. This is kind of the popular understanding in Argentina, that if they were around for a very brief time. They did not contribute very much to Argentine society, and they, quote, disappeared. And in fact, they were being continuously declared to have disappeared before their time. In fact, in the late 19th century, writers in the Afro-Argentine press complained quite constantly that they were being cast aside as no longer being an important part of the nation, even when they were clearly very much present and had social groups and associations and a press and a neighborhood, various neighborhoods and so forth. So on the one hand, what I mean by the many lives of Raúl Grigera is that the stories about him are really the stories of a double, of a fictional character that Argentines collectively scripted in a way to breathe life into the kinds of master narratives of race, right? These narratives of Black disappearance and triumphant whiteness and white supremacy in Argentina. And the plot in these stories responded more to those overarching sort of racial stereotypes than to what Raúl actually did in his life. And then I tried to reconstruct the story of his life in a fairly affluent and well-educated Afro-Argentine family. So for instance, the stories say that he came out of nowhere, or that he was an orphan, or that he was an only child. But in fact, he came from a family of many siblings, or there were 9 in total. It's quite possible to reconstruct the story of his family. And in fact, in the book, I do that going back 5 generations to the man I think was his great-grandfather, who was brought from the west coast of Africa to Argentina. And one more wrinkle in these many lives is not just to trace kind of a parallel between the life of the historical man and these fictional lives that were told about him, but really what I try to do in the book is to go back and forth between those two lives, showing how the stories that were told about him ended up actually affecting the life of the historical man as he lived it. In other words, these stories, which I call racial stories, were having an impact in terms of the kinds of lives that it became possible for him to live as a visibly Black man in a nation in which Black people were supposedly non-existent or out of place.
Now, Professor Alberto, you reside in the United States and you've also written about Brazil. How do you compare Black celebrity in these varying contexts?
That's a wonderful question, because in some ways my career has sort of been built around thinking comparatively between Argentina and Brazil. And in some ways, these societies are polar opposites. Brazil is the country in the Americas that received the largest number of enslaved Africans in the whole period of the Atlantic slave trade. It has the largest African descendant population outside of Africa, in fact, second only to Nigeria. It is a country that has, in general, a deep awareness of the importance of the African presence. This has been, of course, slavery was pressing. It was a clear social reality until 1888. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, and then racial inequality was a pressing issue in the 20th century, and Brazil has the largest Black press written by and for self-defined Black people. It has perhaps the longest standing and most visible Black movement in the Americas. And you compare that with Argentina, a place in which, as I mentioned, in the 20th century, there was almost nothing written on the history of Afro-descendants. There was very little by way of stories that could be told. There were, we know that there were a few Black newspapers in the 20th century, but until very recently, they had not been found. We have now found 2 titles. We knew that there had been some Black organizations, but again, they were very hard to pin down. It was hard to find out information. And so there was a huge vacuum there. And at least in terms of our knowledge as historians, not in terms of the Black presence, but it was harder to sort of tell a story of Black presence in Argentina in the 20th century than in Brazil. And of course, in the broader society, there was still this narrative of disappearance, of the idea that race doesn't matter in Argentina because it doesn't exist, because everybody is white, that racism doesn't exist. And so this pattern of invisibilization is almost the farthest you can get from the situation in Brazil, in which people of African descent have really placed race and racism and Blackness on the agenda of national debates and university research. But in some ways, the situation is not that different, because the ways that racism works across the Americas, although it has very important specificities and particularities in each place, also has a substantial, there's a substantial overlap there in terms of how anti-Black racism works, across the Americas. And so I would say that Black celebrity in Brazil may perhaps be less of something that is considered an oddity or an anomaly. It's not unusual for a person of African descent to become famous in Brazil. So that's a difference from Argentina. I think Raúl is a rare celebrity who was identified as Black in his day and who identified himself as Black. But I think the pressures on people of African descent who are able to rise to such heights, if they are able to achieve them in the first place, which I think is equally difficult, probably in both societies, the pressures on those individuals, I would say, is equally great. And so, for example, if you think about the soccer star Pelé, there was, he's kind of a controversial figure precisely for not openly embracing his Blackness. But this is a kind of a side effect of the way that racism worked in Brazilian society, which was that, especially in the 19th century, there were many men who were of, known African ancestry. The writer Machado de Assis comes to mind as well, but for whom the public sorry, let me try to phrase this in a way that'll be useful. The public acknowledgement by themselves and by others of their African ancestry was not something that was spoken out loud, because it was considered to be something that was shameful. And so I think Pelé is an example of a Black celebrity who was working in that kind of older mold. And the Black celebrities who do embrace their Blackness could be, as in Argentina, as Raúl was, subject to derision, to criticism for, perhaps placing their racial identity before their national identity, or subject to ridicule and to the kind of defamation that Raúl suffered. I mean, it is somewhat in the nature of celebrity to have a story that involves a rise and a fall. But I've found, comparing cases across the Americas, that in the case of Black celebrities, the fall is especially hard. And it's made that way by the spectators, by the people who are watching and commenting on the trajectories of these Black celebrities.
Finally, Professor Alberto, Professor of African American Studies and History at Harvard University, author of the book Black Legend. What's next on your research agenda?
Well, I didn't think that I was going to do another book that was focused on a famous Afro-Argentine individual, but it turns out that that's what I will be doing. I will be working with my co-author Lea Heller, who is an anthropologist and a historian, and also a scholar of Afro-Argentine life and thought and the Black press in Argentina. And this is a project that came out of our shared interest in the history of Afro-Argentine women. So when I was finishing the book on Raúl Grigera, I thought, well, I hope to have shown, after writing this book, which is quite long, it's about 400 pages long, and it covers, it cuts across 3 centuries, and it covers 5 generations. And I thought it is possible to tell a very robust history of an Afro-Argentine man and his family and his community. But I started wondering, was this only possible because he was a man and because he enjoyed some of the privileges of masculinity? He's able to move around the city in a way that a woman might not be because of gender constraints on her honor. And it made me realize that there are not that many Afro-Argentine women who are renowned, actually by name as historical figures. There is one extremely famous woman that the Black movement and several academics have recently put forth as sort of the mother of the nation, María Remedios del Valle, who now has her likeness on one of Argentina's new bills, and who was a soldier and a sort of master of strategy and war and nursing and caretaking in the wars of independence. But there had been not that many other Black women who had risen to national prominence. And recently, my colleague Lea Heller and I were again looking through photographs in the National Archive, and we came across the photographs of an Afro-Argentine woman who was very famous, it turns out, in the late 19th and early 20th century for being a self-taught litigant. And so basically she taught herself the law, and then she dedicated decades of her life to going around suing, using the law to, make sure she was being justly treated. And she sued neighbors and relatives and police commissioners who mistreated her and judges who she think did not treat her fairly in court. And she became known by the end of her life as not only Argentina's most famous sort of popular litigant, but as perhaps the most famous woman in Buenos Aires. And her name was Florentina Ferrari Díaz de Cruella. And she was born in 1846 and died in 1911. And her story really allows us to explore sort of the way that the law was shaped from below, from the efforts of everyday people. It also allows us to explore the ways that Afro-descendants were extremely active in using the rights that they had been able to sort of wrest from the liberal state. And it shows the difficulties for people 1 or 2 generations removed from slavery, the difficulties, but also the successes in Florentina's case of sort of using the courts to prove that they should inherit property that had been in their family, that had been in the family of Afro-descendant people for generations, which required knowing your genealogy and being able to demonstrate it in a court of law. And she excelled at this, and in fact was so good at it, and sometimes pushed the boundaries of claiming that she descended from 2 different fathers at the same time, that she ended up jailed for a crime of imposture for a couple of years toward the end of her life. But she beat that, and she kept litigating pretty much until the day she died. So she's quite an interesting figure, and we hope that focusing on another life and another biography of an Afro-descendant person in a country in which people of African descent were rendered invisible. Invisibility is sort of the mode in which racism was lived in Argentina. We hope that this will help sort of slowly change the way that people think about Black history and the place of Afro-Argentines in the country.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Alberto, professor at Harvard University, author of the book Black Legend. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Gerald. It was my pleasure.
Ditto.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Crystal R. Sanders from Emory University. Find your way into a Black-owned bookstore today and get her book, A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs. We also thank Paulina Alberto, professor from Harvard University, and we encourage you to find her book, Black Legend, The Many Lives of Raúl Grigera and the Power of Racial Storytelling in Argentina. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and ancestor Baba Didan Kamati, and even more love to Sister Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.